Welcome to Gospel Truth with Andrew Wommack, a teaching ministry that focuses on God's unconditional love and grace, celebrating 20 years of discipling others through Charis Bible College worldwide. And now, here's Andrew.
Welcome to our Wednesday's broadcast of the Gospel Truth. Today I'm continuing to teach on financial stewardship. And I tell you, the title to this teaching, Financial Stewardship, is very significant because you are a steward of the resources God has given you. It is not your own. It's not up to you to do it your way. You need to get God's attitude and God's way of prosperity. And that's what we've been talking about. This week I've been using the parable from Luke chapter 16 about this unjust steward. And I've spent 2 days without getting to the main point of the parable. I've just been laying the foundation. If you've missed any of this teaching, I encourage you to please get the resources. Because by breaking the program up into these little 30-minute segments, you miss some of this depth, I believe, and some of the connections. I know not every person watches this program every single day. And even if you watch it every day, well then, you watch it and then you go through the other 15 hours, 16 hours that you're awake during the day, and then you come back and there's just a little bit of a disconnect. You get so much more when you listen to this message in its entirety, plus you're able to go back and play it over or read it again. So these materials that we're offering are really, really important. But let me just go back and say that in Luke chapter 16, there's a parable about a man who was a steward for a rich man, and he had been stealing money. The rich man heard about it. There was an accusation made. He said, "Get your books in order. If what I've heard is true, I'm going to fire you." And so the man continued to steal money from his master, but this time, instead of putting the money in his pocket, he began to take money from his master and give it to the people that owed his master money. And he discounted their bills from 20 to 50%. And it says in Luke 16:4 that the reason he did it was so that when he was put out of the stewardship, they would receive him into their houses. In other words, he was bribing these people with his master's money and using it to gain favor with these people so that he could mooch off of them when he was fired. And when the master found out about it, he commended the steward. I've spent 2 days talking about the attitude of this rich man, that he was so detached from his money and he was so focused on God as his source that even when he saw people stealing something from him, it didn't matter that much because he knew that there was more where that came from. His assets weren't his real assets. It was God. It was the favor that God had given him. And he knew that even if somebody stole something from him, he still had God. He could get it back. And because of this, he was able to be objective and actually find something to commend this crooked steward over. And I've spent 2 days making a big deal out of that because I think it is a big deal. This is an attitude that I think is absolutely essential for you to prosper God's way. All right, but today I want to go into the second thing in this verse 8. Here is the part of this parable that used to confuse me. It says in Luke 16:8, "And the Lord commended the unjust steward because he had done wisely, for the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light." What was it that the master commended this thief for? What was commendable about what he did? He was still stealing money. He was still taking money from his master. Why did he commend him? And here's what I believe that the whole point of this is. The next verse, when Jesus gives his application and interpretation of this parable, will bear this out. But the reason this steward was commended, because finally he began to start recognizing the power, the potential that was in money to prepare for the future. Now that's a big statement. That's a huge statement. He commended this man because he finally began to realize the power and the potential that money has to prepare for the future, to affect the future. Now this is huge. And I think this is so applicable to us today because today the average person has the opposite mindset. The average person doesn't think about the future. It's they're going to get all that they can right now. Then they're going to can all they get and then sit on their can. I mean, the average American, and of course this program is being seen all throughout the world, but most people use money to just indulge themselves right now. They don't think about the power and the potential that money gives you to affect your future. And you can prove that this is what happened to this man right here, this unjust steward, because look up in verse 3. When he had been confronted by his master, it says in verse 3, the steward said within himself, what shall I do? For my Lord taketh away from me the stewardship. That was his admission of guilt. And then he says, I cannot dig to beg, I'm ashamed. Now you have to think about this, but in this statement right here, it shows that all of the money that he had misappropriated from his master, all of the money that he had siphoned off of these accounts, he hadn't used it and invested it for the future. He had blown it on temporary things. Now, it doesn't give us a dollar figure here. We don't know how much this was, but this man had taken money from his master and he hadn't hidden it anywhere. He hadn't invested it. He hadn't planned for the future. He had blown it. And you can prove that because he says he was going to have to beg. In other words, he had no reserves. He had nothing. Now, it's possible that he had taken away hundreds of thousands of dollars and yet he had just blown it on temporary things. He had been buying things like cars, caviar, flat screen TVs, DVDs, all of these gadgets that we have and stuff. See, this is what a lot of people do today. They don't think about the future. They just think about the now. You can see this especially in the American culture. We've got credit, and people say that, you know, there's no reason that you have to wait for the future. You just get it now and no payments for 30 days or something. And most people don't even think about what the actual price of something they buy is. They just think about that, can I get it with zero down? Can I get it without any payments for the next few months? And if it is in the now, if they can get it now, they don't even think about the future. For instance, a car, if you buy a car on credit, and if you get a 5-year loan, did you know that the odds, the chances of you ever getting that car paid off before it wears out are minimal? 5-year loan, 60 months loan, you are going to wind up paying for that car like twice what it's worth. You can see this especially in houses. When you go and buy a house, I remember when I bought a house, that they have all of these forms that you have to fill out, these disclosures, and I saw that by the time we wound up paying that note off, a 30-year note, that we were going to pay for that house over twice what it was worth. But you know, most people don't think about that. They will say that their house cost $100,000 or whatever, and they don't think about that by the time you pay it off, you're going to pay $200,000 or $250,000 over the course of that loan. And they just look at things on a temporary basis. They don't think about the future. Most people are mortgaging their future. You know, in the United States, under the current administration, we have run up more national debt in 5 or 6 years than the United States has run up in over 200 years. And I'm not here to criticize anybody or something, but I'm just saying that, see, this reflects a mindset that people are just doing what it takes right now and they forget about the future. There is coming a day when all of these notes become due. All of the loans that we've taken out from foreign countries are giving them leverage against us. Literally, there are other countries that if they were to call all of our notes due and if the United States had to pay, I guarantee you it could bankrupt America. We are making ourselves vulnerable. We're making ourselves susceptible to these other nations. And yet most people don't think about that. They just think short term. This is a mindset. that is just as prevalent in our world today as it was in the Bible times. And this man had been stealing money from his master, but he hadn't saved any of it. He hadn't thought about the future. He was just using this money to indulge his flesh. He probably had a lot of assets, a lot of things, but you can't live off of those things. He hadn't saved any money. He hadn't invested. He hadn't thought about the future. And the reason that this master commended him was because now, under pressure, when he realized he was going to lose his job, he finally started thinking about how can I take this money that I'm in control of and how can I use this to affect my future? And he finally started realizing the power that was in money to affect and influence the future. This is big, and most people don't think this way. Most people, again, they don't look at the total price they're going to pay for something with interest. They just look at their monthly payments. Can I do this? And they live right up to the edge. They mortgage their life. They basically forget about their future. I've seen this with my kids. We give them a car, and because we give it to them free, it's a car that we've already used, we pass it down to our kids, and because it's free, they don't sit there and think about the future, and they don't realize that, that you're going to have to put tires on this car, you are going to have to service it, there are going to be repairs on this car, and I've seen them learn the hard way, that you've got to budget for these things. You can't just take all of the money that comes to you and just spend it because right now the tires are okay, right now the car is running. You need to think ahead. You need to have some money set aside. You need to plan for the maintenance of things. With our buildings, I forget the exact number, but we have, I think it's $50-something million worth of buildings and assets. And that's great, but I guarantee you it costs money to keep the roof from leaking, to keep everything up, to keep the yard done, to keep the driveways, the potholes. You have to do things. We have to schedule money. We have to think about the future, and you can't just take every penny that comes your way and just spend it on things. There needs to be reserves. And our income fluctuates. We could go down 20%, 30% in 1 month and then go up. And just because your income goes up, you can't take all of that money and spend it. You have to recognize that there are downturns. When people go on vacations in the summer, most people take money that they would send to ministries and they use it to do a vacation. And so you know what? It affects us. And we have to budget for those kind of things. You have to be thinking in the future, but see, most people don't think about stuff like this. They're very short-term in their thinking, and they just think about what can they do right now. This man, prior to this time, had taken all of the money that he had stolen from his master. He had been buying things with it, but you can't eat things. You can't live off of things. He hadn't planned for the future. And when he was finally under pressure and he realized what was going to happen in the future, he still stole money, which the master wasn't commending him for stealing money, but the master was commending him because he was finally thinking about the future and using his position, his money, his influence to affect his future. And that's why he commended him. Finally, you're beginning to realize that money has power in it to affect your future. And if we would think long-term instead of short-term, it would change things. One of the examples that I've used a lot is that my wife and I, rather than going in debt for cars, now we have done that. I'm not saying that it's a sin if you do it, but I don't think it's the best. I think that it's not using wisdom. But see, again, most people, because the car companies will give you like all of these incentives to buy things on credit. Most people will just, figure out if I can make this $300, $400, $500 a month payment, well, then they look at that and they don't look at the fact that they're paying twice as much as that car is worth and stuff like this. What my wife and I did, we would go buy used cars. And we would buy the best used car that we could afford to pay cash for. And then we would take the money that we would have spent on payments and we put it in the bank and we began to save up. And in the next 4 or 5 years, when we needed to replace that car and upgrade, we had $10,000 or whatever. And so we would go get a better used car, and we would still save that money. And the next time with our trade-in and this money we would save, we eventually got to where we were able to buy a brand new car debt-free and avoid all of this interest. See, this is the attitude that I believe that this steward was being commended for, because finally he was thinking futuristic. He was thinking out in advance instead of just using the money that he had and blowing it on, getting as much as he possibly could at that moment. You would be better off to think about the future. Think about how much money you're paying in interest and things like this, and save that money and cut back your lifestyle and take the extra that you could have spent on buying something on credit, put it in the bank, and then keep working your way up to get a better house, a better car, and do things. And eventually you're going to be better off. My wife and I, we've grown in these things, but we were able to pay our house off in 15 years instead of 30 years. We saved hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of interest. It has now been, I couldn't tell you, but it's over a decade or more, maybe 15 years or so since we have bought anything on credit. We pay cash for cars. Our house is paid off. Everything we buy debt-free. We save huge amounts of money, and it enables us to take all of this money that we're saving and to give it. Our giving has increased exponentially from what it used to be. Instead of paying our creditors, we're giving this money and blessing people. Sometimes we've given up to as much as 80% of our income in a year away, and we are givers. And this is wisdom, and I believe that this is why this master was commending this servant. And it says, for the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light. And what this is saying is that sometimes non-believers are actually more forward thinking. They plan for the future better than believers. Now, there could be multiple reasons for this, but I know personally people who've actually, I've heard pastors make this statement that they are going to buy everything on credit, get as much debt and stuff as they possibly can because they believe that the Lord is coming soon, that they're going to be raptured out of here, and they're going to leave all of their debt for the Antichrist. I've heard people say that. And there are Christians that honestly are so thinking about eternity and stuff that they aren't good stewards here in this life. And they don't think about it. Sometimes people who don't think about eternity, they think that this life is all there is and they are having to depend upon themselves. Sometimes those people are more diligent preparing for retirement, thinking forward about how am I going to live after I'm retired, than believers are. And this is what this master said. And he commended this steward because finally he began to recognize the power that was in money to affect the future, the temporal future right here in this life. Man, that is big. And this is why he commended this man, because finally he was beginning to recognize the power that's in money. You know, this is offensive to a lot of Christians who were raised as I was with this mindset that, you know, the Bible here in the King James calls it filthy lucre. I mean, there are a lot of religious people that were raised with this mindset that money is somehow or another evil, that you have to have it, but, you know, you shouldn't have much, that God, it's godly to be on the verge of poverty and to do without and stuff like that. That is not true. And it's offensive to people who have been taught stuff like that to talk about the power that's in money. But the truth is, money does give you power. There are things that I can do now that we have millions of dollars flowing through this ministry that I couldn't do before. It gives me power. Money is not good or bad, but money is an amplifier. You know, if your heart is evil and if you won the lottery, then it just enables you to start doing what was in your heart. But if your heart is good and if you won the lottery, it would empower you and enable you to do good with it. Money just kind of amplifies what's already in your heart. If a person is thinking wrong in their heart before they get money, then it just magnifies it. The statistics show people who win the lottery, that the vast majority of them, I forget the exact statistics, but it's over 80%, I think it's more like 90% of the people who win the lottery in 10 years' time are just as bad off financially as they were before they won the lottery because they didn't steward it properly. They had bad stewardship before they won the lottery. That's the reason they were poor. And once they win the lottery, give them just a period of time and they'll blow it, they'll misuse it, and they'll be back in the same situation. All it did was amplify things. But if a person was a good steward and won the lottery, all it would do is magnify them and it would enable them to do things. Money gives you power. And the sad thing is, most people don't see the power in money to affect your future. Now, I'm running short of time today, and I'm just going to have to say some things, and I'll amplify on this tomorrow. But Jesus confirmed that this is the reason this man was commended, because in verse 9, here's Jesus giving the interpretation and the application of this parable to us. And He said this in verse 9, "And I say unto you, make to yourselves friends of the mammon of unrighteousness." That's an old English way of talking about money. "That when you fail, they may receive you into everlasting habitations." The word fail here in the Greek, it literally means when you die, and it was translated that way in other places in the King James Bible. So this is saying use money to make friends so that when you die, they will receive you into everlasting habitations. What this is talking about is that someday when we leave this life and we go into heaven, you can use money to touch people's lives, to change people, to draw them closer to God, to help see people healed, delivered, baptized in the Holy Spirit. You can use money to touch people's lives, and someday when you enter into heaven, literally they will line up to thank you for investing in them and using your resources to touch their life. And Jesus is saying this is the point of this parable. I'm telling you that just like this steward finally was forced to start using his position and his money to think about the future and plan for the future, Jesus is saying likewise you need to recognize that money gives you power to influence your eternal future, not just in this life, but in eternity. You can literally take something, money that is temporary, that's going to pass away, and you can turn it into something eternal when you invest it in touching people's lives with the gospel. Man, that is big. That's huge. Can you think how important this is to take something that's going to pass away and turn it into something that will never pass away, something that will last throughout all eternity? That's what's happened when you use money to touch people's lives and draw them closer to God. That is something that literally there will be a day when you enter into heaven, you will have people from other nations come to you and say, thank you for giving to the Lord. Thank you for touching my life. And if you could really understand this, it would totally change the way we steward God's money. Jesus is saying this is the best use of money, is to touch people. Not just physical things, but touch people and change their life for eternity. That's the greatest use of your money.
Heeft deze uitzending je aangesproken? En verlang je naar meer? Het levensveranderende onderwijs van Andrew Wommack is ook beschikbaar via onze website. Je vindt hier veel naar het Nederlands vertaalde boeken, dvd's en meer. Er zijn ook veel Nederlands ondertitelde video's beschikbaar op ons YouTube-kanaal. Kijk op andrewwommack.nl.